Welcome to Higher Callings, a podcast featuring interviews of lawyers and other people who, through their careers and volunteer activities, have devoted significant time and energy to serving the common good. My name is Donald Frederico. I'm an experienced litigation attorney with a practice in Boston, Massachusetts. Through my work as a lawyer and my leadership positions in several nonprofit organizations, I've had the privilege over the years of meeting and working with many amazing people who have dedicated significant time and energy towards serving their communities and their professions and helping people in need. My hope is that by shining a light on some of these people and their good works, Higher Callings will inspire others to find their own paths towards making the world a better place. I recently was joined by Phil Mueller, my law school classmate and longtime friend. Phil began his career doing civil litigation in a prominent Boston law firm. But after several years, he left to join the district attorney's office in Schenectady, New York. During his 26 years there, Phil tried 43 felony cases, including 25 murder trials. He also had a significant role in training state prosecutors and police officers. Phil received several awards for his work as a prosecutor, including the first ever Robert M. Morgenthau Award from the New York State District Attorneys Association. The award recognizes recipients for the fair and ethical administration of justice, a theme that we'll be covering in the podcast. We covered a lot of ground in the interview, and so we're publishing it in two parts. Part 1 covers Phil's education and career before he left private law firm practice to become a state prosecutor, and Part 2 will cover his years in the district attorney's office and his thoughts about the role of the prosecutor as public servant. We hope you'll find Phil's story as informative, interesting, and entertaining as we did. So Phil, thank you for joining me today on Higher Callings.
Thanks for having me, Don.
Before we explore your early background and influences, let's provide an overview of your career as a state prosecutor. When did you join the DA's office?
I joined in February of 1990.
And can you tell us about the cases, the types of cases you were responsible for, and how many felony and murder cases you tried?
I tried something like 46 trials and 43 trials, and of those 25 of them were murder trials. There were a lot of other cases, obviously, that you take through the preliminary stages of grand jury and investigation and hearings, but those were the numbers of the ones that actually went to trial.
I should ask you too, what was your title when you were at the DA's office?
I started as Deputy Chief Assistant District Attorney, which is just a fancy way of saying number 3 in the office, after the DA, the elected DA, and his chief assistant. And then in 2008, I was made Chief Assistant, number 2 in the office.
Great. Did you also have responsibility for training police officers?
Yeah, when my boss took over in 1990 and hired me, he was determined to improve on the training of prosecutors. And at
Prosecutors.
prosecutors. And at about the same time, the New York State began the New York State Prosecutors Training Institute, which is a statewide training institute for prosecutors. And they're located in Albany, which is next door to Schenectady. So Bob, knowing that I sort of had an academic background and was more experienced than some of the younger ADAs in the office, over time had me do training for our prosecutors. And I did some work with NIPT, the Training Institute, to help train prosecutors around the state, and some with police as well.
Great, and I'm going to come back to that later on in the interview. But for now, why don't we start and talk about your background? and then we'll
Sure.
come back and talk about your role in the DA's office, your role in training prosecutors and helping to train police officers, and more generally about your views about the role of prosecutors in the criminal justice system and the quest for justice and fairness and ethics in executing their responsibilities. So I know you grew up in Little Falls, New York. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and your high school years?
Yeah, Little Falls is it's a small town, about 7,000 people up in the Mohawk Valley along the Erie Canal, about halfway between Albany and Syracuse. And My dad was a tavern owner in town, and my mom was a operating room nurse in the local hospital. And That's where I stayed for the first 17 years. And it, you had asked me when we were talking about doing this, you had asked me about my path and what brought me to public service. And I started thinking about that. I didn't have a very good answer for you, I think, when you asked me, but I've given it a little thought since then. And I think Little Falls had a fair bit to do with it, because uh, it was a small town. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody knew what you did and what you were supposed to be doing. Um, and nobody had very much money. Everybody seemed to have enough. We had clothes on our backs. We had food. Our parents provided for us, and 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 but nobody was fancy. And
Right.
so growing up, making a lot of money didn't seem to be a goal of life. Uh, you knew everybody, you knew your neighbors, you helped them out when, and they'd help you out if they needed to. And it seemed more important to be well thought of, to be well regarded, to be respected, to be thought of as a person of your word.
Mhm.
And so I think that had a lot to do with um, my dissatisfaction with my private practice, because I just wasn't that interested in the work my clients were doing.
Sounds like
they
you were more focused, community focused, focused on the aspects of community, the neighbors, the people around you. Is that what you're?
Yeah, and I sort of stumbled in. Your last guest, David Hoffman,
That's right.
uh, knew from the start that he wanted to change the world and he wanted to be in public service. That was not me. I didn't know that. I I figured out as I went along what I didn't like, and I kind of backed into public service. And it was only when I started doing it that I realized I'd found my home. Um, what
Now, I
I
think you told me that when you were in high school, you were interviewed by a newspaper, and the issue of becoming a lawyer came up during that interview. What happened there?
well, I'd gotten some scholarship to go to Union College, I guess, and they were reporting on that, and they were asking me, well, what are you going to study at Union College, and what do you want to be eventually? And I didn't know. Um, and by the way, I still didn't know when I went to law school, but there I was. Um, and I said, well, I don't know, maybe I'll be a lawyer. And so they published the article that Phil Mueller was going off to Union College to study law. And I didn't feel bound by that, but it sort of stuck.
So you found now that you've looked back, you sort of see some of your roots in Little Falls as ultimately leading to your work in public service many years later. But you got out of high school, you still didn't really know what you wanted to do. You went to Union College, which is a very good liberal arts college in Schenectady, where you ended up. Um, and tell us about your college experience. What did you major in? What were your interests? And how did Union affect and shape your future?
Um, I majored in political science. My interests were girls, but that probably didn't shape my future. And uh, but I found after I sort of committed to the major of political science that I wasn't really that interested in it. We had to write a lot, and that helped throughout my whole career because I learned how to write. But what I was really interested was literature and poetry, and so I spent a lot of time doing that. But Union was turned out to be critical to my career path because probably in the first week that I was there, when I was in the freshman dorm in 1971, I met Bob Carney, who was to become a great close friend of mine for life. But significantly to this topic, in 1989, um, ran for district attorney of Schenectady County, and asked me if he got elected, would I come and join him? And and the rest was history.
So you two were good friends in college, and then you both went on to different law schools, I assume, right?
Yep, went on to different law schools, stayed friends over the years. He stayed in Schenectady, became a partner in a civil practice, did some work as an assistant district attorney early on, and knew that he liked it. And um, I had several role models, I guess, for prosecutor. One from Little Falls, and um, there were others, but Bob was one. Bob was one of the smartest people I knew, and I knew him to be one of the best lawyers I knew. And so that helped to kind of get me out of the snobbery of, that some of us learned in law school, that the best and brightest always go to the big law firms. And I realized that there may be some truth in that, but it wasn't exclusively true. And some of the best and brightest went into public service, and including criminal prosecution. Bob was a good example of that.
So I don't know if Bob went straight to law school from college, but I know you did not. You took a gap year after college, right?
Yeah, and that one of the things you asked me what lessons I'll have, and I'm going to spoiler alert. One of them is trust your instincts, and we may revisit that theme. Um, but in college, reading a lot of literature. I read a book by Hermann Hesse called Narcissus and Goldmund. And it was all about a young man, Goldman, who sort of jumped off the wheel and went wandering around the countryside, looking for and having lots of experiences, some beautiful, some ugly. But that he had been a student and left school to do that. So it was senior year in college, and we were all looking at law schools and applying, and I did some of that too. But I just didn't. My heart wasn't in going on to law school. I didn't know if I wanted to be a lawyer. I was tired of school. I read this book, and as soon as I read it, I said, I'm not going to law school. I'm going to go out in the world and have some experiences. So I took a year off, and I hitchhiked around the country for a couple months and worked in a paper mill and worked at other jobs trying to scrape money together. And it was a formative experience. It was a great experience. It taught me self-reliance. I didn't have any money, so I was hitching around the country, kind of living on a shoestring, and meeting a lot of people. So it kind of taught me that you could do that, and that I could do that I could so change gears and still be okay. And then when I was working in a paper mill, that taught me that I didn't want to work in a paper mill, and I'd better go back and go to law
Yeah.
school.
It's interesting because I think as we prepared for this, we've discovered, or at least I have, that you and I had a lot of very similar inclinations and some very similar experiences. One area where you and I diverged, not the only one by any means, but one area was that I went straight through to law school and you took that year off. And I know I felt like, in retrospect, I could have really benefited from a little more growing up during that gap year. You feel that you did benefit from your gap year. How did that really help you when you finally decided it was time to go to law school?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And uh, I trusted my instincts to take that year off. My family wasn't happy with it. They thought you'll never go back to school, and you'll regret it. It wasn't the regular path. A lot of my friends rolled right into law school, but I thought I was kind of tired of school, and I think if I had started law school 3 months after leaving Union, my heart wouldn't have been in it. Having the year off, maybe growing up a little bit, I'm not sure about that, but maybe. Um, I went into it uh, seriously, and I was refreshed. I was ready to study again, and I think it was much easier for me to put my heart and soul into that first very difficult year of law school than it would have been had I gone straight in. Who knows? Um, but and I approached it as oh, I'm not going back to school. I'm going for a professional training. Uh, and I in my first week in law school, I was running up the stairs late for class, carrying an armload of books, and I stopped and I thought, I'm back in school. This is
Yeah,
school
it
again.
is school after
Yeah,
all.
after all.
Well, that's great, and that's where I met you. We both were in the same class at Cornell Law School, and both of us upstate New Yorkers who landed in Ithaca at Cornell. We didn't know each other first year very well. I think we got to know each other second year, and second and third year we knew each other quite well. But how did law school prepare you first for what came next, which was private practice? I'm kind of skipping over the clerkship you did, and we'll come back to that. But ultimately, for what you did for all those years in the DA's office, how did law school prepare you to do that kind of work?
Uh, I thought it prepared me well enough. I didn't learn anything about criminal law in law school. Just I didn't pick it up, and but I learned how to work hard. Obviously, as you know, you don't get through it and do well unless you learn how to work hard. Um, but and I know this is another place where our paths are similar. Um, the Socratic method, I look back on it now, um, was very exciting to me. And it wasn't to all of our classmates. Some people
It was
really
pretty
hated it.
scary. It
Yeah,
was scary at
it
first.
was, well, and it was scary to me. But I remember in my contracts class, uh, Professor McNeil,
You had
um,
Professor McNeil. I had
Ian
Professor
McNeil.
Robert
Yeah,
Summers,
yep,
both very well known
yep.
scholars.
And uh, I I had the usual paper chase experience of being called on at the beginning of an hour-long class, and then being grilled, being required to stand up and being grilled by the professor um, throughout the whole class. I never sat down. And at the end of that experience, after we were all leaving class, there were actually classmates who came up and were slapping me on the back and congratulating me on how well I had done. And I couldn't remember at that point a single question I'd been asked or a single answer I had given. It was all blank. And yet, as scared as I had been, it was thrilling. And I should have recognized it then, and I don't think I did, that was preparation for trial work, for standing up in court and enjoying on some perverse level the risk of at any moment being completely humiliated and being able to respond in the moment despite your fear, rather than freezing up, being able to respond. And it took me a while, I think, to figure out that, that's when I really felt alive. But I learned that's from law school. And the other
And
thing,
I'll just stop for a
yeah,
second and say, obviously, you must have done really well in that because you got all those people slapping you on the back. But also, I just want to say, in Professor Summers' class, we didn't have to stand up when we were called on. So I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm actually surprised. I'm hearing for the first time that people in your class had to stand up, and it sounds
I,
like that was really helpful in a way.
it was, and the other thing I think that may have changed my life in law school, several things, but one, and it had to do with law review. We were both on law review, and we worked very closely together on law review.
Let me just stop for a second. Phil, just for the listeners, Phil was editor in chief of the Cornell Law Review, which is one of the things that makes his path a little different because it's not necessarily the path you would expect an editor-in-chief of an Ivy League law review to follow. But we'll come back to that. Go ahead, Phil. Sorry to interrupt.
And as you remember, in the second year, when we were lowly editors for the law review, we were basically worked to death. I stopped going to my classes. You probably had enough energy to do your work and go to classes, but I didn't. And I remember early on living in the library, doing site checking and all that sort of scut work that you had to do.
Yeah, I was going to call it grunt work, but yeah, we're
grunt
thinking
work,
the
exactly. I remember being miserable. I didn't have a girlfriend. I was lonely. I was being worked to death. It wasn't really fun work to do. And I remember walking around, people would say, "How you doing, Phil?" And I would tell them truthfully how I was doing. And I was miserable. And one day it came to me that I wasn't making myself any happier by saying that. And I was spoiling the days of the people I was talking to by saying that. And it couldn't have been fun for them either. And then I decided, well, I can't change my circumstances now. I'm in this, I've committed to it. But I can change my attitude toward those circumstances. And I decided when people asked me how I was doing, just to tell them, I'm doing great. I'm doing fine. Everything's good. And I did that. And after a little while, everything was good. Everything felt better just because I was changing my attitude toward it. So I learned from that you can endure a lot of things. And if you control your own attitude, it makes it a lot easier to get through it. And that was useful in those long trials I did years later when you're not sleeping and you're flying by the seat of your pants some of that time and you're totally exhausted.
And you weren't alone in your misery. I think a lot of us were unhappy from time to time. Certainly the people on law review, including me, we were working so hard for so little reward. It seemed at the time that it was difficult. You were always great at picking me up when I was down. I hope I did the same for you once in a while. But
Well, we had fun.
yeah, we did.
Yeah,
Yeah, we did. It was a great
that's
experience.
the way I'm remembering it.
So then you had a number of summer jobs. Obviously, we all had summer jobs during law school in different places. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the summer jobs you had and where they took you?
So after my first year at Cornell, I got a job as a law clerk for the Herkimer County District Attorney's Office. So that was my first actual exposure my first exposure to criminal law was in ninth grade when my English teacher had a mock trial and I was the defense attorney. And my friend Mark, who later became head of the Boston or of the Rochester Bar Association, was Mark Moretti was the prosecutor, and we tried this case, and it was all tape recorded and played back to the class. But but my first actual experience with the criminal law was working at the DA's office in Herkimer County, right next door to Little Falls.
Yeah, can
Uh,
you just help us, people who aren't familiar with the geography of upstate New York? So
sure.
I think you said Little Falls is somewhere between Albany and Syracuse,
Yep.
but north,
About
right?
halfway. It's west on the thruway from Albany, about an hour and 20 minutes. It's situated just below the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, and it's surrounded by rural areas, farms, and
And
such.
where was the Herkimer County DA's office?
Herkimer was the town right next door to Little Falls, and Herkimer was the
Okay.
county seat of Herkimer County, and Little Falls was in Herkimer County. And
And
in
then just
fact,
for,
yep,
or go ahead, I'm sorry.
the district attorney for Herkimer County lived in Little Falls, um, and he was another one of these role models. He was maybe not the archetype of a local prosecutor. He was erudite. He was sophisticated. Um, and he was very thoughtful. Uh, and he told me to be a district attorney, you have to know everything. You have to know everything about your community. Um, and and I think he was right.
Wow, that's incredible advice. Was that advice you kept thinking about while you were working in Schenectady?
Well, I've remembered it all these years,
Yeah.
and I certainly it's probably easier to know everything about Herkimer County, as sparsely populated as it is, than it is to know everything even about Schenectady County, which is somewhat more populated. But if you cut that sentence off as you have to know everything, yeah, that was kind of my approach to prosecuting homicide
Very,
cases.
very thorough in your preparation and investigation of cases.
And yeah, and not just because I am am such a diligent guy. It's because every time I walked into court, I was scared. As many murder cases as I did, and as successful as they were, I was scared. Every time I went in, I thought, maybe I will not be prepared. Maybe I won't be prepared enough. Maybe I will embarrass myself. Maybe I will let down the victims or my boss or the community, or the investigators who put the case together, or my assistant counsel. But most of all, maybe I will embarrass myself in court. And so, I over prepared as a hedge against that, and it paid off. So you keep doing it because you get rewarded for it.
Um, so Phil Mueller grew up in Little Falls. He went to college in Schenectady. He went to law school in Ithaca and spent a summer in the Herkimer County DA's office. And then after second year of law school, you end up in Boston, Massachusetts. How did that
Nope.
come about?
After second year, I went out to LA and worked for a big firm
Oh,
out there.
I'm
Uh,
sorry. Okay.
Lovely firm, nice folks. Could have gone back, but I didn't want to live in LA.
So
Another
even a
example of,
a
yeah.
bigger move than I anticipated. I mean, so you weren't sure, I guess, what you wanted to do, and you thought you would try a big firm in private practice in a big city. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, I thought I probably wanted to move to a city, and experience that. I didn't know where, um, and those summers were great chances to go someplace, and not have committed to it, and explore it. So I was very happy to have done that. And then after third year, before going off to the clerkship, the federal court clerkship, I got a summer clerk job in Boston.
And why Boston?
I wanted to live in a city. I didn't want to live in LA. And I didn't think I wanted to live in New York City. And Boston seemed like a good compromise. It was big enough. It had culture. It had a lot of opportunities, but it still had a feel like you could walk from one end to the other of it. And I liked that.
And you also knew from the beginning that if you were going to be a lawyer, you wanted to be a litigator, right?
Yeah, that's like a lot of us. That's sort of what I grew up thinking lawyers did. And and So I really, it didn't occur to me, I think, to want to be a corporate lawyer or to do deals or whatever. And again, that wasn't what was interesting to me. It was, I think, the give and take, the adrenaline rush, that attracted me. So yeah, I thought I wanted to be a litigator.
And I guess in keeping with that goal, you decided to apply for federal court clerkships, and you ended up clerking for a federal district judge in Portland, Oregon, correct?
Yeah, as you know, the federal district court is the trial court level in the federal system, and then of course there's the Court of Appeals, and a lot of our colleagues applied to both. Some of them worked at both. Um, and I applied to both because there was no guarantee you were going to get an offer. And there's another place where, on reflection, instinct may come in and the willingness to kind of take a risk. Um, I had been told, I don't know if you, when you were applying for clerkships, I don't know if you were told the same thing, but I had been told if you get an offer from a judge in the federal system, you're lucky, and you take it. You take the first one you're offered, and if you don't, the judges have a network and they talk to one another, and you're likely to be blackballed. And other judges, in solidarity with the one you turn down, will not offer you a clerkship. So it happened that I got an interview down in Richmond, Virginia for the U.S. Court of Appeals.
The Fourth Circuit.
Fourth Circuit, yeah. And I went to that interview and was given an offer of a clerkship. Lovely judge, very well respected. But I really wanted to try the trial court because I thought a court of appeals, research and writing, it's all the same stuff we've been doing for 3 years in law school. I'd like to try something different. And I was really kind of hoping to get an offer somewhere on the West Coast because I wanted to see either Northern California or the Pacific Northwest. So I had to decide, and I turned down the job on the Fourth Circuit, and then lived in fear that I would be blackballed. But I did get an interview with the chief judge of the District Court of Portland, Oregon, with Judge James Burns, who liked to call himself, and was called by others, James the Just. He met me in a casino in Reno, Nevada, because he was sitting down there by designation as a visiting judge.
Okay.
and he came in Bermuda shorts. I came in a three-piece suit. It was hot. I was sweating, and he. I liked him immediately, and he asked me, "What do you like to read?" And I told him I like to read poetry. And I didn't think I was going to score any points with that answer with a federal
Probably
judge.
not what most judges would be looking for.
Not that I thought, but it was true. And there, and that was a sort of a non-traditional course in college that I'd taken, the poetry courses and the creative writing courses. And it turned out it paid off because he was a poetry lover and he said, "Oh, I love poetry." And he sat there and he recited by memory the entire Robert Service poem, The Cremation of Dan McGee, which is
Oh,
sort of
gee.
doggerel, but it's high level doggerel.
Yeah.
And and he then made me his law clerk and let me write, not only as all law clerks, drafts of his opinions, but also drafts of the speeches he had to give from time to time as chief judge of that court. So it was a great experience, and maybe because I'd fallen into poetry in college, I got that job.
Well, I don't think I remembered that entire story, and it had to be it had to take a lot of courage and be very frightening to turn down that Fourth Circuit clerkship because most of us probably would have killed for that clerkship.
Yeah.
I didn't apply for it, so I can't say I would have. But no, it turning down a federal appellate court clerkship in the hope that maybe you'll get a district court clerkship is again kind of an unusual move. I think I'm becoming. There's a pattern here of Phil Mueller kind of taking the road less traveled, if we could put it in poetic terms. We also had a law professor. I don't know if you remember this, but one of our professors talked to a large group of students about applying for clerkships. And I remember he was very much an advocate for applying for district court clerkships as opposed to appellate clerkships. I think for the very reasons you're citing. He just thought the experience of being in court, watching trials, dealing with pretrial motions, and the fact that he viewed federal district judges as the most powerful people in the United States government, at least that's what he told us, all made that all sound really attractive. But I think also getting out of the library, getting out of the books, and actually seeing cases unfold in action, as you say, was one of your motivations, is a very important driver for that.
And one of the opportunities that gave me was to watch some criminal trials tried as prosecutors, the U.S. Attorney's Office out there. And although the light still didn't go off in my head that that's what I wanted to do, I was very impressed by them. They were professional, they were prepared, they were straightforward, and they came into court always wearing navy blue suits. And years later, when I was trying homicide cases, I always wore a navy blue suit to trial. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So you did the clerkship. We talked about your summer jobs. And then after the clerkship, you did end up back in Boston, but this time with a different law firm.
Right.
But I guess you must have liked living in Boston enough the one summer you were there that you decided to go back.
I liked living in Boston, and the law firm I'd worked for the summer was a lovely firm of nice people. I could have gone back there, but I kind of wanted to try a firm that had a reputation as being a little less conventional. I mean, as big firms go, they're all fairly conventional, but the firm that I ended up going to had a reputation of having sort of egghead lawyers and doing a lot of public interest work. And that, even though I wasn't putting myself into the public interest realm, that seemed attractive to me.
Right. Well, it was a very good firm. It still is. You were there for a span that covered about 9 years, though you took a leave of absence, I know, for family reasons. And we don't need to go into that unless you want to. But what were you doing in private practice, and then we'll lead up to why you decided to leave private practice.
I worked at that firm for about 2.5 years, from 81 to 1983. Does that
Or would
sound
it have
right?
been 1980? I think you and I did our clerkships from 79 to 80.
Um, yeah, is that,
Did,
well, let's see, 79. No, I ended up working like about a year and a half for our clerkship
oh, I
because
see.
it was a
Okay.
1 year clerkship, but I like to joke that the judge wanted to make sure he got a year's worth of work out of me. So he kept me for a year and a half. But actually, it happened that my replacement couldn't come on board, so he asked me to stick around longer. So I stretched it out to a year and a half, and then
Oh, and
um,
then you must have had time to take the Massachusetts bar exam then?
yes, yeah, I took the Oregon bar when I was out there, and then took the Massachusetts bar when I left the clerkship and settled in Massachusetts. And so it ended up being 1981 when I started with the firm, and then in '83, you alluded to the family issue. I had my father was very ill, and it struck me that, um, and I also wasn't thrilled with uh, this what passes for civil litigation in a big firm, which is, as you know, often delaying litigation and avoiding litigation. And you don't, in the early years at least, get into court very much. So I was thinking I might have made a mistake with
Yeah.
that profession. It was a wonderful firm, lovely people. They treated me nice, but and of course paid
And
well.
you did have some trial experience pretty early on, as I recall.
Not in that first
Okay.
segment.
Okay.
That came when I went back. But I decided that it was a good time to get off the wheel again. I wanted to think about other things to do. I thought maybe I'd write the great American novel, which never materialized. And I also wanted to go home and see if I could help out with my father's illness. And I thought, you don't know how this is going to work out, but if you don't try, you're never going to, you're going to regret it. So I went to the firm and I told them I'm quitting. Uh, I'm going back to Little Falls. I didn't really want to tell them why, but um, they said, "Well, we understand. How about taking a leave of absence? How long will you need?" And I said, "Well, the things I want to accomplish, I'm sure will be resolved one way or the other in 6 months." And they said, "Well, why don't you take up to a year as a leave of absence?" And I said, "Fine, that's more than generous." And I went back to Little Falls, and I was there for a year and a half, for the reasons that I'd gone there. And at the end of that, I'd spent up all my savings. I was living in a farmhouse. I'd spent all my savings. I'd read a lot of books. I hadn't written any. And I hadn't figured out what to do. Uh, I had some thoughts of other professions to get into, but I hadn't decided. And so I called up the firm and said, "Well, uh, I don't know if this is the right career for me, but would you take me back now?" And they said, "All right, come on back." And I said, "I'm probably not going to stay. Um, I'll probably be there for 6 months or so while I get economically on my feet again. I'll work hard while I'm there, but I'll probably be looking for something else." Um, and they said, "Okay," and let me come back. But I think they they had questions about my commitment to
I guess.
to that type of work at that point, and they were right about that.
You gave them a
And
few subtle hints about that, it
yeah,
sounded
well,
like.
I was honest with them, and
Why
you
why
know,
were you so thinking that you were likely not to want to stay either in that law firm or in private practice generally at that point in your life?
yeah, and it wasn't that law firm. I thought
Right.
if I'm going to be in private practice and civil litigation, I'd love to be there. They were good, but it just I was working very hard, as we all were in these big firms, but and this became even more evident when I went back. Uh, it didn't matter to me. Uh, it mattered to me that I did a good job. I worked very hard, and I wanted people to think I was good, and I wanted to succeed, like all of us. And I have a friend, your friend also, Dave Pearson, who calls us all praise junkies, his term, and that was true.
Well, you also
So
liked winning too, right?
yeah, oh yeah, I was very competitive. I liked winning, and I liked people thinking highly of me. And I had a great deal of pride in my work, but I did not care about the subject matter. And if I'd read about these cases in the paper, if I'd seen them in the paper, I wouldn't have read about them.
What kinds of cases are we talking about, Phil? Just generally.
Hey, all
Breach of
manner of,
contract claims
yeah, sure,
between one
yeah,
business and
employment
another. Or...
disputes. Um, I barely can remember them because they didn't stick with me. But
And you were always representing corporate clients too, right?
yeah,
Or not
I
always?
did some pro bono work. The firm was very good about that. So sometimes I was representing individuals. And as I think as civil litigation goes, I had a pretty good mix of experiences. But there were a couple things that made it stand out to me that I was in the wrong place. One is that I'd go home for Thanksgiving or holidays, and people would ask me what I did, and I couldn't bear to tell them because to me it was so tedious to do it the first time. I couldn't bear to repeat it. And and the second thing was I got to the point where, and you know where I worked because you had clerked in the federal courthouse right across the street from where
Oh,
my
and I had a
firm
big
was.
case.
Yeah,
I had a big case with your firm for a number of years, and I was in
uh,
those offices quite
sure.
frequently
Yeah,
too.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the civil action, um, and I would take a bus. This is in my second iteration there. I would take the express bus from where I lived outside of town, Newton Corners, and I would then be dropped off and I would walk to work. And when I would see the tall building that I worked in with all those little windows, it began to look to me like a tombstone and my tombstone. And then I started to think, this is perverse, I suppose, but I started to think if I got hit by a truck on my way to work, what would be on my headstone? And it would be, here lies Phil Mueller. He successfully delayed litigation against General Dynamics for years. And and I got so I couldn't live with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as I did, and I think even as much a perfectionist I was, um, I think it started to show up in my work. It certainly showed up in my attitude, and there came a point when I'd like to think that I was doing this um, because subconsciously I knew I had to leave, but I don't know if that's true. I kind of hope to leave as a partner. Um, but if I'd been made a partner, I don't know that I ever would have. And who knows? But I went to my firm in the year that I thought, despite all my perambulations and interruptions, I thought, yeah, I've been out of law school long enough and I've done good work. this should be my year. And, they do the pre-partnership decision interviews. And I said, I think this is my year. And they said, well, this may not be your year. You took time off.
Took a lot of time off.
All this. And I said, well, I think it's my year. And I'm going to take it personally if I'm not made partner this year. And I kind of wanted to force the issue. And
isn't that kind of interesting, though? I mean, you knew you weren't happy doing the work in the law firm, and yet it was important to you to be elevated to partnership. That seems a little inconsistent to me, but maybe it isn't.
It's that competition. It's that success thing. I wanted to leave on my terms, and be able to say, I did everything that could be done in that setting, and now I'm gone. And I wasn't made partner that year, and I could have stuck around and tried the next year, but that was it. And I said, no, I'm going. And I told them I was leaving. I still didn't know what I was going to do.
All right.
And
so
at that time,
how did this come about that you ended up in the I want to say Schenectady District Attorney's Office?
Well, it was
Is
the fall of
Schenectady
1989.
County District Attorney's Office? Okay.
Schenectady County District Attorney's Office. And that was the fall of 1989 that I said, I'm leaving this firm. And my old college friend, Bob Carney, was running for district attorney then. And he called me up and, I'm talking to him. And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. He said, well, if I win, would you want to try prosecuting in the Schenectady County District Attorney's Office? And I said, well, I don't know what else. I thought maybe I would go back to grad school and get a graduate degree and teach English somewhere. But that seemed daunting because those jobs are hard to come by and they don't pay you much anyways. And so I said, okay, I'll try it if you get elected. And he did.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of my interview with Phil Mueller. Please stay tuned for part 2, which includes our conversation about Phil's work as a prosecutor, the role of prosecutors as public servants, and Phil's thoughts about the current national movement to enact federal legislation to reform policing.
This has been an episode of Higher Callings. Your host is Donald Federico. Music is provided by Fancy Mountain, and our logo was designed by Matt Pedro. Higher Callings is edited by Brian Federico. Higher Callings is a production of Federico Media, LLC.